Alright, got an interesting critical thought today. We're going to be discussing the two overriding philosophies when it comes to designing bosses in video games. Now, boss design is an extension of enemy design from pretty much pick any genre of video game known to man. But when it comes to enemy and boss designs, we can be as simple as that very annoying pattern the Medusa heads do in Castlevania, all the way up to something like Ludwig in Bloodborne. Nevertheless, as game design evolved, and we saw the growth of the action genre with titles like God of War, Devil May Cry, and so on, there are two distinct forms of boss designs. Before we get to them, very quickly, when we talk about bosses, a good boss should always test the player in some unique aspect, and the boss fight should be visually and gameplay distinctive from the rest of the level or the enemies the player is fighting. But when it comes to boss design philosophy, the two overriding forms are having a random pattern or a fixed pattern. Now, the term pattern, when we're discussing enemies, is the kind of attack they are going to perform to hurt the player. Again, we can be as simple as, a little Goomba walking across the screen to something like enemies in Soulsborne, Bayonetta, you name it. But patterns are an essential part of any kind of enemy design, because as the game developer, you are not going to be creating emergent attack patterns. There is not a game alive that the boss or the enemies will literally create new attacks to use against the player. At that point, we're getting to some kind of Soulsborne Skynet realm of AI design. But when it comes to these patterns and how the enemy performs them, again, the two main thoughts are, or two main schools are random versus fixed. A fixed pattern means that the boss or enemy in question will perform the same attacks at the same rate, at the same times, every time you fight it, no questions asked. And again, the Medusa head in Castlevania is a good example of that. Goombas walking around, even if it's something that has some measure of variability, such as the enemies in the Binding of Isaac. When you're fighting those normal enemies who just like run and chase after the player, they are built on a fixed pattern. They are only going to perform that attack. The little slight emergent behavior is that the enemy is always calculating the path from it to the player. So if you move behind an object or you move away, it will try to adjust and find the quickest route to you. Fixed patterns also correspond to boss battles that are more about puzzle design rather than an actual fight. If you've played almost any action-adventure game in the last 20 years, you have probably seen examples of this. From bosses in Zelda, Mario, Uncharted, you name it. Jak and Daxter, and again, so many platformers have made use of fixed bosses. The key trait, or the key thing that will determine whether it's a fixed or random pattern, is that fixed patterns typically don't allow you to break or skip a phase. And that's a popular term used for speedrunning, wherein you'll watch a speedrunner, they do enough damage, they can sometimes skip a boss's next set of patterns and basically move on to the next. But typically for casual play, you'll see this in a lot of puzzle-based fights, where you'll perform a crazy set of actions, you'll get that hit on the boss, and then the boss will kind of reset, the player gets set back to the beginning of the room, you name it, and then they go to phase 2. You repeat that, you go to phase 3, you do it again, boss dies, you win. But because it is a fixed pattern, it means that there's not really any sense of improvisation or emergent behavior out of the player. I know I just have to do the same thing each time. Maybe there's less platforms. Maybe there's more enemies in the field. Whatever the case may be, there's only one way to beat this boss, and then you move on to the next fight. And for action adventure-based games that are more about puzzle design, this can work to some extent, especially if the boss is distinctive or unique enough. Many puzzle games, such as Catherine, or I'm drawing a blank sadly, But there are games that will have like puzzle elements to the boss, and you're kind of competing sort of passively with the boss to complete the puzzle while they're doing something to mess with you. But when it comes to a fixed pattern, again, it is limited in just how much variety you can have. Because as the player, I know the boss is always going to do these set actions, so I can adjust accordingly and beat them. Typically, a fixed pattern is great for the first time, but it gets very dull and repetitive if you're repeating this game or if you have a boss rush situation. Now, a random pattern is something that has been around in small elements since the late 80s, early 90s, but has really taken a growth in popularity with the arrival of games like Devil May Cry and the Soulsborne series. A random pattern means that the enemy will still have a set number of actions that they can perform. They could shoot their gun, they could jump at you, maybe they do like a little dash. But the order in which the enemy will do it is entirely randomized. Sometimes this is based on the enemy's health, their position to the player, or even attack that they did beforehand. But the idea is that if the boss has 6 attacks it can do, I, as the player, don't know which one they're going to do at any given time. One of the oldest examples of this would be from the Mega Man games, wherein each one of the Robot Masters has a different set of attacks they'll do. Now, of course, if you only have 2 or 3 attacks, then most likely you're going to get that repeated pattern. But this was kind of the start. Random pattern design really blew up in terms of popularity with the growth of the action genre. Again, games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Fury, Soulsborne, and so on. And the point is, the enemies or the bosses have multiple attacks that they can perform. But you just don't know what they're going to do. And what this does is it creates a layer of improvisation or emergent behavior out of the enemy that you're fighting, especially for boss fights who typically have more patterns to pull from. Again, if you've ever played or watched someone do a Soulsborne title, you can see that they know what to do if the boss does X, Y, or Z. They just don't know what order they will ever see those attacks. And this takes a whole new form of difficulty when you look at some of the more challenging boss designs. Earlier I mentioned Ludwig from Bloodborne, and that's considered one of the best fights out of the series due to just how wild that pattern is. And the reason why it is so unpredictable has to do with how From Software designed and kind of scoped out Ludwig's AI. In the Soulsborne series in particular, most of the bosses will have at least 2 to 3 groups of patterns based on their proximity to the player. Some attacks within each pattern are designed to move the enemy either closer or farther away from the player. So in Ludwig's case, what can happen is Ludwig will be at mid-range. He'll do an attack pattern that forces him into close range. The second that attack is finished, he will immediately pull an attack from his close range pattern pool. Then let's say after that he may do an attack that pushes him back to mid-range. Then you could do another attack that sends him back to close. And again, as the player, there's just so many attacks to deal with that you have to be consistently on the ball to get around this. Now, what's very interesting about this kind of boss design is that one of the more interesting or subtle ways you can impact difficulty is the cooldown period between patterns. If you've played any Soulsborne game, whether you're fighting enemies or bosses, you'll notice after certain attacks, they will not do anything. And this could be for maybe like a millisecond or even less than that. So it'll be like slash, slash, let's say horizontal slash, they'll wait a second, then they'll maybe do like a shoulder push or a shield bash. That brief period, oh, my mouth is having trouble there. That brief period in between the attack patterns is that kind of wind down animation or that cooldown period. And the less of a cooldown period you have, the more the attack patterns will flow into almost one continual attack. So it's like slash, slash, then immediately a shield bash, then immediately a dash forward. Now, the problem with this is that if there are no cooldown periods or safe ways for the player to attack the enemy or get around, then you need to give them another way to avoid those attacks. Maybe a parry or repose, maybe a stun attack, stuff like that. But if there is no cooldown period and there's no way to kind of get around the enemy, if they just keep attacking endlessly, then that's going to make things very frustrating, especially if the player has their own cooldown period. You'll see this in a lot of action games where, let's say a combo is a 3-hit string. After that 3rd hit, you can't move, or you won't attack for, let's say, half a second. This is why some of the better action games will typically allow a dodge or a defensive move to break the animation. So let's say I'm doing slash, slash, and then halfway between that slash, the enemy attacks, I can hit dodge, and my character will immediately get out of that attack chain. But when it comes to boss designs and to begin to wrap things up, it really depends on what you're going for. Most abstracted based titles, such as RPGs or roguelikes, will typically feature a fixed pattern. Many games that focus on action, that are about testing the player's reaction time or how well they can handle the character, will go with a random pattern. And typically a random pattern affords a lot more flexibility in terms of how the fight plays out, and some of the best boss fights we've seen have been random patterns. But there's a lot that goes into getting that balance right. You need to still give the enemy some kind of weak point or something for the player to capitalize on. With Ludwig, for instance, most players find that staying between close to somewhat mid-range is the safer option, as his close-range attacks usually leave him open to more assaults. And that's typically how Soulsborne works, that once you get in on the enemy and can get those attacks off, it's usually easier to fight than having to engage the guy at mid-range or get around those attacks, especially for anyone who fought something like the Unnamed King or Champion Gundyr in Dark Souls 3. But for those of you watching this, what are some of your favorite examples of a random pattern fight not from Soulsborne? And then to make things more interesting, can you think of fixed pattern fights that were very engaging to you? And before anyone says anything, the Zelda Breath of the Wild bosses, despite having 2 or sometimes 3 distinct phases, is not an example of a fixed pattern, as players who are strong enough can just basically rip the guy down, and they're able to attack him almost at any given point, with a few exceptions. But thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And be sure to subscribe to our Discord channel, now open to everybody at the basic level. But until next time, have a great day. Before we get to the credits, I just want to give a quick shout out to the fans and supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/GWBycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.